What's up, sports fans? This is the Lucas Ross Sports Channel. We continue with our 2025 college football schedule preview and very early projected record series. The Clemson Tigers are up next. Before we look ahead to 2025, let's take a look back at what Clemson did in 2024. Here are my projections and predictions last year for Clemson. Again, my projection for this team was 9-3, and then my prediction for them was also 9-3. And Clemson did just that. They went 9-3 last year in the regular season, so I was right on the money with their projection and prediction from last year in 2024. But their overall record was 10-4 if you count the ACC championship win and then the loss to Texas in the first round of the playoff. So yeah, Clemson went to the college football playoff last year as a number 12 seed, as a conference champion, of course. And yeah, that was the best thing about this Clemson team. They went to the ACC championship and won it, but they lost the first round of the playoff. But at least they made the playoff for the first time in like 4 years. That was their first appearance since like 2020. This was the schedule from last year for Clemson. And again, they were 9-3 with this schedule in 2024. First off, you look at who they played in the non-conference. They, of course, had to play a couple of teams out of the SEC. They played Georgia, of course, in Atlanta. That was not even a close game whatsoever. They also played Appalachian State in the Seidel. That's an FCS team there. So 2 pretty easy wins. And then South Carolina out of the SEC as well. And they lost to South Carolina. So they lost to 2 of those SEC teams in Georgia and South Carolina last year. And they lost to South Carolina at home, which was really embarrassing there for the Tigers. It's not the only time that they lost to South Carolina in Death Valley. They've done that a couple of years ago as well. But yeah, that was a tough loss there. And with that, they were able to go 9-3. But you look at their ACC schedule. First off, you look at who they played at home last year. They played NC State, Stanford, Virginia, and then also Louisville. They lost to Louisville there in the beginning of the month of November. Yeah, that was another tough loss there for Clemson. I don't get it. Why they lost to Louisville there in, the month of November in Death Valley, of course. That was also a night game as well, so I don't really see how Clemson lost that game. But that was a pretty tough loss there. And then you look at their road schedule. They played on the road at Florida State, Wake Forest, Virginia Tech, and Pittsburgh. So they won all their road games last year in the ACC. They beat Florida State. Of course, Florida State ended up not being as good as we thought they were going to be. Wake Forest was not really good last year. Virginia Tech was not really good as we thought they were going to be. And then Pittsburgh was just pretty average. That Pittsburgh game actually went into overtime, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, that was a pretty tough game, but that was your schedule from last year. Let's now look ahead to 2025. This is that upcoming schedule here for Clemson for the upcoming 2025 season. And before we go game by game, let's take a look at who Clemson plays in the non-conference this year for 2025. This is the non-conference schedule for Clemson. And again, you look at this non-conference schedule, they'll play 4 non-conference games. They're going to be playing, of course, LSU. The Battle of the Tigers here on opening night. I think this is a 7:30 kickoff here between these two teams. Yeah, this is going to be a big-time matchup. LSU has played a lot of big games under Brian Kelly now in the last 3 years. Clemson has played a lot of big games, too, against SEC teams, but I think this will be a pretty exciting matchup. Again, it's the Battle of the Tigers here, the ACC versus the SEC. I think the good news is you get this game at home if you're a Clemson fan. Again, it's not on a neutral site venue, which really kind of is not really exciting and everything, but I'm kind of anxious to see this game. I'm really excited to see this game here on this non-conference schedule for Clemson. And then they play Troy and Furman, both teams that, Clemson should be big favorites in. And then they play on the road at South Carolina. So they played South Carolina every year, of course. That's the rivalry game they always play in rivalry weekend, and they will play that game on the road this year. So this non-conference schedule is a little bit tough when you got a couple of SEC teams and LSU and South Carolina. It's kind of similar to last year where they play a couple of cupcake games, and then they play a couple of SEC teams. But they get LSU at home, but they have to play South Carolina on the road. So that's your non-conference schedule. Let's now move on to the home conference schedule in the ACC for Clemson. They'll play 4 home games in the conference this year. They'll play Syracuse, SMU, Duke, and Florida State. So they get all 4 of these games at home. Syracuse, SMU, and Duke, 3 teams that were really good last year. SMU will be a rematch, of course, from the conference championship. Syracuse, was pretty good last year. Maybe they're not quite as good as they were last year, but that could be a tricky game. You never know. Syracuse has kind of given Clemson some problems over the years. And then Duke. Duke beat Clemson a couple years ago on opening night on Labor Day in 2023. But this time, Clemson will play them at home in Death Valley, and then they play Florida State again. And this time it will be a home game here for the Tigers. And Florida State was one of the worst teams in the ACC last year, so not a tough home schedule here for Clemson. Let's now move on to the away schedule. They'll play 4 games on the road in the ACC. They will play on the road at Georgia Tech, North Carolina, Boston College, and Louisville. And just got to be honest here, looking at this road schedule, it's pretty tough for Clemson. I'm not going to lie. Georgia Tech and Boston College, 2 pretty average teams from last year. These are 2 trap games, in my opinion, on the road. And you got North Carolina. North Carolina, Bill Belichick taking over down there for the Tar Heels. I don't want to really go too far with the Tar Heels just yet. I get it. There's a lot of hype for this team because Bill Belichick is coming over. But we don't know how good of a coach he's going to be at the college level. This is the college level. It's not the NFL or anything. So I'm kind of anxious to see how Clemson does in that game. And then you got Louisville here. Of course, you lost to Louisville last year at home. This time you will play them on the road. And that game, of course, will be on a Friday, which I'll talk about here in just a moment. Well, that's your away schedule. Let's now move on back to the schedule here and go full game by game now for the Clemson Tigers. Again, they start things off with that big game at home, Week 1 against LSU on August 30th. Again, this is going to be a huge non-conference game to kick off the season. And again, the good news is they get that game at home. And again, the Battle of the Tigers here in this one. Then they'll play Troy after that here on September the 6th. Then they go on the road to play Georgia Tech. They open up ACC play here on the road at Georgia Tech on September the 13th. Then they'll play Syracuse at home on September 20th. They get a bye week here. Actually had a pretty good time. They go on the road to play North Carolina on October 4th. In my opinion, I think that's a pretty good spot for a bye week before a big game against North Carolina here against the Tar Heels. Again, you're going up against Bill Belichick for the first time in his era here at North Carolina. And then they play on the road at Boston College on October 11th. So they got back-to-back road games there with North Carolina and Boston College. Maybe that's not a really good spot for the bye week before North Carolina, but I do like that bye week there for Clemson. You get a bye week before playing a big road game against North Carolina, but then you got to play Boston College the next week, which really will kind of be tough because you're maybe coming off a physical game against the Tar Heels. But yeah, back-to-back road games there, North Carolina and Boston College. Then it's back at home for SMU in a rematch from the conference championship from last year on October the 18th. Their second bye week comes in the last weekend of the month of October. They'll play Duke coming out of the bye week on November 1st. Then they'll play Florida State at home as well on November 8th. Then they go on the road to play on a Friday night against Louisville on November 14th. That's going to be a pretty tricky game there in my opinion. And then you got Furman at home on November 22nd. And then they close things out with a rivalry game on the road at South Carolina on November 29th. So that's your schedule for Clemson. In my opinion, this is kind of a tougher schedule compared to last year. Again, LSU and South Carolina both in the non-conference, and then you got some tough road games with Georgia Tech, North Carolina, Boston College, and also Louisville. Plus, you got South Carolina on the road. So these will definitely be tricky games here for Clemson for 2025. The home schedule is not bad, but the road schedule kind of could be a factor here for the Tigers. Let's now get to the projection here for Clemson for 2025. This is the scale I have been using here for my projections. And remember, if it's a 1% game in the red, that's counted, of course, as an automatic loss. You're not going to be able to see any games on here where Clemson's going to be an underdog in, though, in the red, orange, and yellow in those percentages, because we know Clemson will be favored in almost every single one of their games. So you're not going to see any games on here where Clemson's going to be an underdog. 20% games, though, in the orange will be games where Clemson will be a double-digit underdog. 40% games in the yellow will be games where Clemson will be a clear underdog game by about a touchdown. 50-50 games will stay in the white, games that really can go either way. And then your 60% games in the purple, These are games where Clemson will be favored by about a touchdown, 6, 7, 8 points, somewhere in that particular range. And then your 80% games in the blue. Those are games where Clemson will be favored by double digits, by a couple of touchdowns, 10 to 14 points, somewhere in that particular range. And then your 99% games are your automatic wins. Those are games where Clemson will be big favorites in. And that's the percentage we'll start here first. So we'll start with your automatic wins here for Clemson. I think you got a couple of them on here in the green, Torrey and Furman. Yeah, Clemson definitely should be big favorites in both of those games. I think these games are definitely over that 95 to 99% mark. Again, Clemson has no business to lose both of these games. It would be a big shock if they were to lose one of these games. You know, Torrey used to be a pretty good team out of the Sun Belt, but they haven't been the same since, so Clemson definitely should be big favorites in both of these games. They're not guaranteed wins, but we count them as automatic wins here in this projection. So we now go to the next percentage. That's the blue games, where I think Clemson will be favored by double digits, 10 to 14 points, somewhere in that particular range. And I gotta be honest here, I don't have any games here in the blue for Clemson. When I look at this schedule, I feel like there's a lot of games that potentially could be trap games. Even some of these home games here for Clemson could potentially be trap games. And when I say trap, I mean games where Clemson will be favored by 6 or 7 or 8 points. And that brings me to the purple games, the games at 60%, where they'll be favored by about a touchdown. That's almost the majority of their schedule. 6 games here in the purple: Georgia Tech, Syracuse, North Carolina, Boston College, and Duke and Florida State. These are all potential trap games here for Clemson. Georgia Tech, obviously, the reason why it's in the purple is because it's on the road. Same thing with North Carolina and Boston College. You can make an argument that Syracuse, Duke, and Florida State, those games should be in the blue, but I'm going to put them in the purple just for right now. Syracuse and Duke were pretty big surprise teams from last year, and then Florida State, obviously, the worst team in the ACC, but this team still has talent. I mean, they're probably, not on the level of Clemson, but they got some players that will come in from the transfer portal every single year, and I get it. The Seminoles were not really good last year, but based off of the game from last year, Clemson winning it, that's the reason why I'm favoring Clemson here instead of making it a 50-50 game. So, again, all the 6 of these games are definitely trap games, in my opinion, for Clemson. Again, all these games are going to be games where Clemson will be favored by 6 or 7 or 8 points. So, by about a touchdown, somewhere in that particular range. And then that leaves you with 4 50-50 games: LSU, SMU, Louisville, and South Carolina. Louisville and South Carolina both on the road. 2 teams that beat Clemson last year. That's the reason why they both belong in the 50-50 range. And then you got SMU here in a rematch from the conference championship because of the game being close last year. That's the reason why it's a 50-50 game. And that LSU game, that is a very tough one to predict right now. And I can't wait to predict this game once it comes to the month of May and everything. But yeah, that's a big game. In the non-conference, it's a 50-50 game in my opinion. I think Clemson, definitely has an advantage because they're playing at home, but both of these teams are very talented nonetheless. So 4 50-50 games that I think can really go either way here for Clemson. So what does the projected record look like based on how tough this schedule is for Clemson? Well, we count the green games as wins, and then you average out all 6 of these 60% games in the purple at 60%. Then you average out these 50-50 games at 50%. Let's say they split these 50-50 games. Let's say they win 2 out of the 4 50-50 games. You win against LSU or SMU, and then you lose to Louisville and South Carolina. That's going to give you a projection of 10-2 here for Clemson. So, again, the projected record for Clemson is 10-2 based on how tough this schedule is and just based off of where the teams were from last year. Again, if you split those 50-50 games, they win 2 out of the 4. That'll give you 10 wins, and then you got the 2 losses that could come from those 50-50 games as well. So that'll give you 2 losses. That's how the projection came out to be 10-2. I think worst case scenario, probably 9-3. Last year's projection for me was 9-3, but this year it's a little bit higher. And then I think best case scenario probably is 11-1 for Clemson. So what do you guys think? Is Clemson going to do good this year? Give me your projection here for Clemson down in the comments below. And do you agree or disagree with this projection? Let me know down in the comments below as well. Give me your thoughts about Clemson's schedule. Is it not tough or not so tough? Thanks for watching this video, and stay tuned for more sports content videos on my Lucas Ross Sports YouTube channel.